This is an interview with Thera Corbett Brown, widow of Floyd Brown, at her residence at 146 Main Street, Akron, on January 30th, 1981. The interviewer is Gladys Brown. Thera, I'd be interested in your telling me whatever you can about the Corbett family, the background and something about them way back.
But the only thing I know is that the original Corbetts came over about the time of the Mayflower. Part of them settled in the New England states, and I'm not too sure which. One of the family went to Pennsylvania, and that is the family, as far as I know, that my dad was connected with. And then when they came into New York State, I'm not sure. But he lived here. He was 13 years old when his folks passed away, and I don't know which one first. But and he went to live with a sister, and then in 1901 he was married.
And who did he marry?
Ines Lind, Inislyind, and they moved here from Warsaw in 1898, and they were married in 1901, and he built the house here at 146 Main Street that I live in now, and I was born here in 1904. Wanted my dad to join the Ku Klux Klan way back when, and he said he might agree with their ideas, but he was a businessman, and he wasn't going to. But Floyd found out afterwards that they did a lot of inquiring around because Corbett is an Irish name. My dad worked on a farm down near Medina for quite a while, and then he worked on another farm off on the route that goes into Medina. Worked there for a while. Then he came back to Akron, and he went into the carpenter business, and his brother, Dan Corbett, had the lumberyard. My dad did the contracting, did the building and so forth. Well, my mother told me that he had built 31, and she had a list of them, but I can't find the list, but I do have quite a few that I know that he built. He built one at 27 Clinton, one at 4 Madison, one at 9 Bloomingdale, and one at 20, 22, and 30 Parkview Drive, 5 Exchange Street, 6 Exchange Street, 51 East Avenue, and on Buell, he built 100 Buell Street, 102, 104, 106 for Mr. Sutton. And then he built one at 51 Buell and 53 Buell for Mr. Sutton. He also built one on 19 Marshall. Oh, wait a minute, the two big ones. Chicks down there, I can't think of the number. He also built one at 77 John Street and 79 John Street, which was the last one that he built. He did carpenter work after that, but no houses. Well, my grandfather, on my mother's side of the house, was a Civil War veteran, and he lived here. He had a photographic studio down on the corner of Monroe and John. Andrew Lind, L-Y-N-D. And from there, he went into Buffalo. He had a studio on Main Street. He had one on Seneca Street. And then when he got so that he couldn't be in the photographic studio, he was back here. And of course, I knew him before he died. And I used to hear stories of the Civil War once in a while, which were kind of things I didn't really care about remembering. But anyway, and my mother, of course, was always very active in veterans organizations, mainly on account of my grandfather. And from the time I was a little girl, even way back when the Park Theater was here, and they had Memorial Day exercises in the Park Theater, I remember very clearly one time I was supposed to sing. Well, I was little, and they stood me up on the chair. And I looked down at my mother, and she didn't start to play when I thought she should, and I finally said, well, I'm ready to sing. Everybody in the place roared. But anyway, almost every Memorial Day, I had something to do with the veterans and their exercises and so forth, and I knew practically all of the Civil War veterans that were alive, the ones that formed the J.J. Peck Post number 398, which was an Akron group. And my mother was instrumental in starting the daughters of the Civil War veterans. And the organization here at that time took part in all of the Memorial Day exercises. The daughters decorated all of the Civil War veterans' graves while they were able to, and finally they turned it over to the Legion. And we decorated sometimes around 144 graves at Memorial Day. And since the daughters have disbanded, I still have been active. Whenever was asked, I've still been active in Memorial Day exercises, which I enjoy very much. Well, all I remember is my mother, again, was instrumental in getting the Civil War Veterans Monument in the park. And she and the daughters collected money, and through different people in town and the businessmen downtown, and they got enough money to erect the monument in the park for the Civil War veterans, which had the statue of a Civil War veteran on the top of it, which now has been ruined, I guess. I don't know if it's been able to be fixed or not. But anyway, when the monument was up and was ready, it was to be dedicated, and they had special services here. And I was a little girl at that time, about 11 years old, and on account of my grandfather, I was asked to unveil the monument, which I was as proud could be. I have a cane that my grandfather brought back with him when he came back from the war, and the head of the cane is a hand holding a ball. And he used to tell me the stories that the head of the cane was carved from a Confederate soldier's thigh. Ooh. A lot of my school remembrances and so forth was whenever there were plays, or in fact, when I got up into high school, we used to have opening exercises, which they don't do anymore, I guess, and Miss Leopold was our principal, and she used to have the opening exercise. She'd have a hymn and a Bible reading and another hymn. And then whenever there were plays or anything, there'd be a school orchestra. In fact, I got a group of young people together from school, and we used to play for the different school plays, and we used to have one just about every year. And then whenever they had basketball games at that time, they used to have them in the old Park Theater because there was no place in the school. And sometimes they dance afterwards, and I usually got the job of playing for them. But anyway.
Was that piano?
Yeah, played the piano. And at that time, but for the plays and things, we used to have the orchestra. There were some of the young people in school that played instruments, and we used to get them together, and we had the orchestra and so forth. In fact, one of the first orchestras that was here in town was part of the school orchestra and some of the adult people here in town, and I used to play for them. And R.S. Mills Jewelry Store used to be down on Main Street, where Mark Bates opened a meat market there at one time after the Mills was in there. And Mr. Mills had a very serious fire. There are 3 basements under that building, and the fire got down in there, and it was a very, very serious fire. And there was another fire up this side of there, and I was trying to think where it was, and I can't remember now just where it was. Where you remember Mark or Irwin Bates?
Yes.
Irwin Bates had the meat market. Well, that used to be R.S. Mills' store. And at one time, R.S. Mills was across the road where Claude is now. And he moved, I remember right, he moved from there over to the one on Main Street, across the road rather. And then, oh dear, his name was Peterson. And they had a Ford agency in there. They had a repair shop in the back. The repair shop was still there when I worked in the post office down there. When I was a little girl, the post office originally was down in the candy kitchen block, down Main Street, right? Just this side of the village hall. And Mr. Skillen was postmaster down there. Well, then it was moved up into the Shad building where Ross's are now, and there's a clothing store in now where the post office was when I went to work. I went to work in the office as a sub in 1923, the 1st of August, 1923. And the post office was there until 41. And between Christmas and New Year's of 41, we moved up where the present post office is. And I worked for the post office for 42 years and retired as assistant postmaster.
When?
In 65. I've been assistant postmaster for 9 years.
Now, you worked under several different postmasters.
Mr. Downey was the first postmaster that I worked for. Mr. Downey was a postmaster on Main Street, where the clothing store is now. And Ed Laughlin went in there before we moved, and Ed Laughlin was postmaster when we went up into the building where they are now. And Ed retired because he was 70 years old, and Neil Shavaki was appointed postmaster. And Neil was still postmaster when I retired. He was postmaster for about 7 years. I went into the post office the other day, and I had 3 letters to get stamped, and the girl and I was visiting a little bit, and I said to her, give me 3 3-cent stamps, and she looked at me. I said, oh, I'm sorry. I said, I'm back in about 1920s, 23 or 24, when I was working in the post office. I said, I got to have 3 15-cent stamps. Lois was in there, and then she looked at me. She said, what do you want? I didn't think of that. She said, what do you want? They were working over the weekend at Christmas time. They used to ask me to work on Sunday. Well, at the time, I was playing the organ in the Lutheran church. And I'd go to church. They'd give me my time off to go to church. And then after church was over with, I'd go back to the post office maybe around 1 or 2 o'clock. There was nothing for me to work till 5 on a Sunday afternoon. We always had our mail caught up. We had mail come in on Sunday. We had mail go out on Sunday. They haven't done that in years. They were still doing that when Neil was in there, before I retired. Mail came in on Saturday afternoon during Christmas time and came in on Sunday during Christmas. But they don't do that anymore. Originally, back when I worked in the post office, the mail came in at 7:30 in the morning and left at 8 o'clock. Came in the afternoon at 2:30 and left it back for Buffalo at 5 o'clock. And we also made up mail for Clarence Center, Buffalo, but I was trying to think of the name. It's over.
Alden?
No. Let me see. Clarence Center, Bowmansville and Buffalo, plus the airmail pouch. Belonged to the 100th Regiment in Buffalo.
Your grandfather?
My grandfather. And my mother, they formed an auxiliary to the 100th Regiment, and she was secretary of that. Already a home on that property,
On the Tesno?
on the where the Tesno house now stands, there was another house there. And when my father was going to build it, that house had to be moved. He got a mover from Lockport, and the house was moved down Exchange and up Main, and the first house this side of the Lutheran Church used to stand where the Tesno house now stands. And I was around 7 or 8 years old. Well, it was a curiosity to me to see them load that house onto this moving van thing and going to take it from one place to another. I don't remember how I got there, but I got up on the front porch of the house that was being moved. And when my dad saw me, I got off in a hurry. Got me spanking and sent home. Then my dad built the Tesno house and so forth, and he made the spindles that are in the railing that goes upstairs, unless it's been changed, not that I know of. And it had the majority of the windows were leaded plate glass, which was, at that time, was something rather new.
December. On the 14th, we're having election of officers and our annual Christmas party. And the person in charge has asked me to raise a couple of questions. Anyone who has interesting, I guess they aren't questions really, who has interesting or unusual ornaments, old or new, please bring them to trim our tree. In other words, there's going to be a tree. And these ornaments would, of course, be on loan and you receive them after the party. Do you have an old or perhaps mystifying tool, kitchen implement, or other antique item? Please bring them to the party, probably for identification or just interest. Old pictures, Christmas cards, and other holiday memorabilia would be most welcome. We hope to have a little change of pace next month and have our Christmas party. Our speaker tonight is not a stranger to many of us. He's been here before, speaking on other topics, and I've known the speaker and his family for a number of years. They and I were in the same school district together many years ago. Our speaker works for the New York State Gas and Electric, but he has a number of hobbies. He's an amateur archaeologist, and following along in that hobby, he has become interested in arrowheads. And before he does speak, I would like to call your attention to 3 displays that we have here too, to supplement what our speaker is going to tell you. Laverne Cummings has, his display is over to my right and on my extreme left. Tony Rader's display is here on my immediate left, and Al Bassanello has a display on my extreme right over near the wall. And we are very appreciative of these interested residents bringing the display to supplement, augment what our speaker is going to tell us. And I'm very pleased to introduce Carl Meerwald, who will speak on the story of the arrowhead. Carl?
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown, for that fine introduction. It is a pleasure to be here in many ways. Meet old friends I haven't seen in a long time, to see these wonderful collections. And I do really enjoy going out on these historical talks, especially to historical societies, because I always come back with more than I went out with. And I'm also very pleased to see the number of historical societies that have come into being in the last few years. I myself think it's a wonderful movement. Because in my first encounter experience when I started in Indian lore, and I started to inquire what and where to find it, and what it was when you did find it, and I always got the information that, well, there was a dinosaur bone found here on the Conowongo Creek, and that's found in the Peabody Museum. There was a mastodon excavated in East Randolph, that's at Albany State Museum. And not even a library or a school had an arrowhead or anything. It was all shipped out somewhere else. And now these historical societies are bringing it back home where it belongs. To many people, this could be just an odd stone or a curiosity piece. To the archaeologist, it can be an unwritten book of history. But you know what this really is? This is an invention. Needless to say, as any invention, such as the automobile or the television, they have a great effect on our lives. In fact, this is the oldest invention we can find. This is the first thing that we can find that shows where man took something from nature and converted it into a useful product. So here we have the beginning of manufacture. Now we look at early man and try to picture him in a world surrounded by the mastodon, the hairy mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger. Until he had something to defend himself with, he must have led quite a confined life. He must have had to stay pretty close to the cave or a tree or something. But once he developed a weapon, not only could he defend himself, but he could also go out in the world and eventually hunt down these animals and use them for food and clothes. But unfortunately, the characteristic of these implements required a mineral such as flint or quartz that had the proper chipping characteristic. And the deposits of these minerals were quite few and far between. So man decided that it was best to locate near an ample supply. And of course, soon the places, the sites where this material was available, all became occupied. Now you have a situation where one group of people control the material that was essential to someone else's well-being. Now, how were they going to get those on the outside? How were they going to get their supply? They would have to trade food or implements or something for it. So here you had a system of barter coming into being. Now, the fortunate people who did occupy the known sources of these raw materials, they soon learned that they had a product that was much in demand. And they began to spend more and more time in the manufacture and the mining of this material. And they spent less and less time in fishing, hunting, and growing crops. So now you see a craftsman emerge. The craftsman of those early days was similar to the craftsman of today. He took pride in his work and was continually trying to improve upon it. And that's why you will see the transgression of the arrowhead or spear point from some of the very crude, bulky spear points up to a very finely worked blade as the Iroquois warhead. Now, in order to get the benefit of this story, let's go back again to very early man. first weapon probably was a stick that he grabbed up to beat off a wild animal. Soon he learned that a sharp stick was more effective. Then he learned that a sharp or jagged piece of stone was even more effective. Next, he combined the two, and the hand spear came into being. Now his first problem was to find out a way to attach those sharp stones to the stick in such a way that it didn't drop off when he went to use it. So he began to cut notches into the base of the stick, or the point, so that he could securely bind it to the shaft. And we find these notch plates that served his purpose very well. And we find them through all their collections, you'll see them. All civilizations were known to use them. Then we get up to the Iroquois, who were more interested in developing a weapon of war. They made the point much smaller, sharper, and they had wide points at the base, which were also very sharp. Now this point was set into the split end of the shaft in such a way that these base points protruded beyond the shaft. Now when this was shot into a victim, the shaft could be pulled out, but the stone remained embedded, and which in those days was usually fatal. That same system is still used by Aboriginal people around the world for dispensing poison arrowheads to their victims. Now, not only did the arrowhead itself go through these stages of change and development, but the bow, or the manner of launching, also shows a progression. As we said earlier, man's first weapon was the hand spear. The only difficulty with that was that he had to get too close to an animal or an enemy to strike it. So he began throwing it. Now this he could do from the hiding place behind the rock or from up in a tree. Then to further the development of it, he cut a notch in the shaft of the spear. He tied a leather thong around his wrist, and he would loop that thong through the notch in that spear handle so that when he threw it, it traveled in a wider arc, and it gave him the ability to throw much further and much harder. And that was known as the javelin. And that is the weapon that hunted down the great mastodon and the saber-toothed tiger. Then one day, while trying to bend a green sapling, or break one, probably trying to make a snare for a wild animal, man became aware of the power of wood bent and held under tension. It did not take him long to put that into use in the longbow. And that proved to be very effective weapon. In fact, right today, there are many deer hunters out chasing the deer with a longbow. It has survived all the ages, and is once again a very popular sporting weapon. And it was very successful down through the ages. When we get to medieval Europe, man decided to wrap himself in steel. Although the longbow was the most accurate weapon that he had, it lacked the striking force necessary to penetrate light armor. So once again, man put his inventive mind to work, and he developed a crossbow, whereby he used a mechanical means to apply more power to give him more strength to pull the bow back, and therefore gave him the striking power that he needed. And even after that was replaced by gunpowder for military use, the crossbow remained a very popular sporting weapon in Europe for many years. But today we usually associate the arrowhead with the American Indian. Yet it is a known fact that when we compare the findings of the archaeologists with the written records of world history, we learn that every civilization on the face of the earth, including of our own, pass through a stone implement stage where they use these weapons. They're found in the tundras of Russia, they're found under the ice caps, they're found anywhere in the world where man has been, they have found and still find these stone artifacts. So you can rightfully say that the story of the arrowhead is actually a story of man's progress. I've just briefly touched upon the immediate effects of the use and the development of the arrowhead that it had on man's progress. Now I would like to spend a few moments to tell you how these various implements were made, and by so doing, I will show you how their manufacture brought about some more changes that affected man's life. Now, all of these flint implements were made by a fracturing, chipping, and flaking process. Now, the characteristic of flint or quartz that made it so suitable for making arrowheads and spearheads and knives is that if you take a lump of flint and you strike it with another stone, it shatters this way into splinters instead of breaking straight down through such as granite or sandstone. Now, this first fracturing process was usually done at the mine site, where they broke out the chunks of flint, and they would shatter it there, and then they would only pick out the pieces that were suited for whatever they wanted to make. And these they carried home, and they were stored until needed, and they were even used as money in trade and barter. And once this flint sliver or flake was obtained, then they kept flaking off. They kept hitting the high spots with a round, what they call a hammerstone, which you can pick up a bushel basket full on any Indian site. They're just nothing more than hard heads that are just fit the hand right. And they would keep tapping that and flaking off until they got it down to where they wanted. Then they took a chipping tool, which was usually the curved end of anchor horn or bone. And with that, they would lay the article on a softer base, quite often a buckskin pad on their knee. And they would take this tool, which was a curved chiseler awl, and they would tap it with a stone, with a hammer stone, but they would just nick up. And you can see on any of these you look, you'll see this cutting edge. Well, that's how that was put on there, how that was obtained by this little chipping process. You probably have heard the story, as most people have, that arrowheads were made by heating them in a fire and then dropping cold water on them to make these chips. And that is not so. There are a few arrowheads in these collections that I've noticed. One characteristic of flint is that if it is fired, it loses its temper and it becomes chalk. Now you might be interested to know that the largest known flint mine in New York State was at Coxsackie, near Albany. The museum excavated that, explored it around 1900. And they found actually carload after carload of these flint fragments dumped down over the hillside, which was scrap, which was not suitable. So that shows how big an operation was there. And the museum tried desperately to have that made into a state park. It got tied up in politics, became a political football, and was defeated. And shortly afterwards, they put a main highway through the site and it was destroyed. It was one of the best-known mining sites and sources of flint this side of the Mississippi. Now, when you explore these early mining sites, these pits where the flint was taken out, they discovered evidence of fire, very hot fires. Now, the character characteristic of flint is that it usually is in layers, embedded in other minerals. And of course, flint is the hardest stone you've got, so it was awful hard to get it up. So they believe that they built huge fires in these pits, and got the stone hot, and then dumped water on it, cracked this rock that was holding them, and then they could drive in wedges and bring out pieces of flint. But the heat of these fires must have melted some of these other minerals. They formed droplets, which later cooled in the ashes. And of course, man being very curious, looking always on the outlook for new material, he picked up some of these lumps and tried to chip them. They wouldn't chip. But lo and behold, he could hammer them in their desired shape. Historians feel that that is how the use of copper was found and was used by quite a few Indian civilizations, especially the mound builders. And it probably was the same method that the early Incas discovered gold in Central America. Now, the more man worked with these stone implements, the higher the degree of perfection becomes apparent. One man has a display over there that is category as engaging. If you were ever down in Ohio and visit any of the museums down there, you'll notice the fine work of the mound builders, the Hopewell. Their ceremonial axes and spearheads were as polished as modern day jewelry that we make them. And that was actually the peak of the stone era. Now, the same inventive instinct that led man to improve on these tools led him to discover that he could make one good set of stone tools, which was quite time-consuming. But with a good set of stone tools, he could make implements out of other material which was readily at hand, such as bone, antler horn, and wood. Now, that is the stage that the Iroquois had reached when the white man came to the Blue State. They were at the brink of coming out of a stone area through their own endeavor. And of course, the same ingenuity certainly must have been what later led man to create a machine which probably in one day could make more tools or materials than the early craftsmen could have made in a lifetime. Now, no doubt at one time or another you've heard the story that all arrowheads are different and that each maker should identify his own. That is not true. Perhaps it originated from the practice of certain tribes using identifying binding, coloring in the feathers and shafts. Nevertheless, there are many distinctive types of arrowheads, and they all fall into special categories. Each type is characteristic of the civilization or race which used it. Now I'd like to show you the types of these arrows most commonly found in this area and how they're classified. I worked this up for scout group. To show and tell. And I find out that it's the easiest way to explain it to adults. There are two basic forms of arrow or spearhead. One is a triangle, the other is a leaf shape. Now, you take the triangle, put an indentation in the bottom, you've got a triangular.
Hidden behind your podium.
Oh, you've got a triangular concave-based blade. You put the notches in the side, you've got a side-notched triangular blade. You put the notches in the bottom, and you've got a base-notched triangular blade. You knock the bottom corners off, and you've got a stem triangular blade. Now we apply the same thing to the leaf shape. the bottom, you've got a base notched, leaf-shaped blade. To knock the bottom corners off, you've got a leaf-shaped stem blade. You put the notches in the side, you've got a side-notched oval blade. And you put the indentation in the bottom, and you've got a leaf-shaped concave base blade. Now, the most important factor of those two classifications is that taking the triangular form, the widest part of the triangular form is always at the extreme base. Therefore, that type blade or point would be used, such as the Iroquois took advantage of. The Eskimos used it on their harpoons. The triangular blade, when shot into an animal or a victim, could not be withdrawn. So we know that the people that used and made the triangular blades, that they hunted and lived in cold-blooded animals, seals, walrus, and so forth, with the exception of those who were using it for war purposes. You take the leaf shape, and we know that always the widest part of that is elsewhere except at the base. Any projectile point of the leaf shape, when shot into an animal, would always make a larger opening in the shaft itself, which would induce bleeding. We know that the people that made and used leaf-shaped blades hunted and lived on warm-blooded animals. Those are your two main classifications, and they tell us quite a bit about the people that made them. Now, to find any one or two of these points on a given site doesn't necessarily mean that those people actually lived there or that race. Because there was always travel, interchange, trade, and of course through warfare, through capture. So that whenever a site is explored, these different classifications of points are recorded on a percentage basis. For example, if you were to peer into your neighbor's garbage can and find one whiskey bottle, you wouldn't say that he was an alcoholic. But if your percentage of whiskey bottles to other garbage was about 6 to 4, then you might have been right. Now, all these types of various arrow points and spear points and the location where they were found, that is more important than the artifact itself. They tell us quite a story. For instance, they tell us how far from the Ohio Valley the early mound builders ventured into western New York and southern Canada. How far from the Finger Lakes region the Iroquois warriors penetrated into western New York and Pennsylvania. How far the Algonquins traveled from the Hudson Valley northward into Canada and thence across the Great Lakes in their search for rural better hunting. Now let me explain how all this would be of interest. Let us consider for a moment the work of the archaeologist. Just what does he attempt to do? The goal of the archaeologist is to fill in the gaps in history that are not recorded in writing. Now, you all know that our history books tell us that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. They also tell us that when he arrived here, there were people already living here who he called Indians. How many of you have ever wondered how the Indians did? Well, by studying all these artifacts, the characteristics and movements of the people that used them, we hope to be able to answer that question for you. Now, the first known and accepted explanation was that there was one migration from Asia into America via the Bering Straits. However, we now have information that points to at least 2 migrations into this continent. The other possibly from Western Europe via Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And that right now is not just a theory, it's becoming fact. architectural patterns among the early people of America, and also in their pottery, and also in their bone structure, in the skeletal remains. And now, since they've had the improvements of the carbon test method where they can date various material from sites, the radioactivity, they're finding that these sites are much older. They're finding that the Viking occupation of America, which they thought was not an occupation before, they thought it was just occasional landings to get fresh water. But right now they have unearthed in Greenland actual village sites of Vikings. And these Viking stones and different markers have been found all across the Great Lakes into Wisconsin and Ohio. So there now is practically definite proof that there were two different migrations. So you can say that the arrowhead is an unwritten book of history. It can tell us a lot. And it's had an effect on the lives of each and every one of us. In closing, I'd like to pay tribute to this little stone artifact with a few lines of a sentimental poem that was written over 80 years ago. I do not know the author. Deep buried in the forest clay, long lost and snugly slept away, while summer winter passed it o'er through 50,000 years ago. While saplings into oaks upreared, while road by road the land was cleared. So glancing from the pale-faced plow, it wait to reach the land of now. Perchance could, but thy tale be told, some wrinkled arrow maker old, patient labor, chip by chip, slow rotting, bark and edge and tip. Gone are the warrior and the bow, gone are the wild red forest folk, like their own shafts forever sped on all thy will, O arrowhead. Thank you very much.
Artifact Society, the Southwestern Artifact Society. I had that given to me as a gift. And it's interesting to read if you're interested in this type of hobby. But like I said, I found it very interesting, and it's, like Tony was saying, it's, sometimes it's, you go out and you hunt for hours and you don't find a thing. Another time you go out and you find 3, 4. And I'm going out, I remember that one day that I hit a real good site. Farmer came in and told me that on this one certain mound that he had been finding these arrowheads, and he told me it just, he said the conditions are just right to finding them. So I went there and I found 27 pieces altogether in that one day. 17 were good and 10 were broken.